Sometimes a new piece of software comes along and it changes how you operate things. For me, SvelteKit's remote functions, more specifically forms, is one of those. It does change fundamentally how we interact with forms, and it feels more like a real framework and everything is integrated. It provides us a better developer experience and also a more type-safe one. So let's take a look at this. And if you're new to this series, I'm creating a travel journal app where we can create trips to different places and create entries to journal our travel to that place. That's it. But what we're going to do here today is we're going to refactor this form here to use remote form functions. And then once that's done, we're going to refactor this other form here to create entries and delete entries. So let's go and get on with it. First, let's take a quick look at how we're operating right now. And if you watched my previous video on action forms, you're going to see that this file to create a new trip is a little bit different prior to the other one. And the one thing that I changed here is that I created a schema here. And why did I do that? And why is that different from the previous one? Because I wanted to have a one-to-one comparison with a remote form function. And remote form functions need a schema. So to have a equal comparison, that's why I created this. But in essence, I'm defining a schema here where I'm saying that I have a destination field, I have a start field, and both are required, and I have an end field. Then I am retrieving the values from the form, and I am validating that against the schema. If there are any errors, we're returning those errors, and then we're returning the original values in here. If there are no errors, I'm getting the final values from the parsed schema. And there's another validation that I need to make, which is in my application here, there cannot be two trips to the same place, or at least with the same name. So that's what I'm validating here. And then I need to return errors if there are any. And then I need to return if there is a destination that already exists with that name. If there are none, I can just create the trip and redirect. In the markup, what I'm doing is I'm getting the values from the form here. I'm defining a local state and I'm setting the data using an effect. Why I'm doing that? Because I'm using a snapshot, which is a state management feature of SvelteKit, which is fairly new to me, I have to admit. What it does is, if you're not familiar with that, and if you haven't watched my previous video on SvelteKit state management, but let's say I'm traveling to Paris here and I accidentally click away. If I come back, Paris is still filled up. So that's what it does, snapshot here. It preserves the state of the form when you navigate away from the page. But in order for that to work, we need to capture the current state by returning the values from the state here, and then restore by setting the values back. That's why I have this state manipulation in here. Then in the fields themselves, I'm binding to that state, and then I'm verifying if there are errors for each one of those fields in the errors attribute. Now you can see here that there's already an issue. That's because in my validation here, I'm only returning in this piece of code here that if there are errors for destination. So I need to say start date does not have any error, and also end date does not have any error. If I come back here, you see that this error is gone. That's it. Let's start implementing now a remote function. So I'm going to come back here to the trips.remote.ts file that I started working on in the previous video about remote query functions. And I'm going to copy some code and paste it here. Let me import app form from app.server, import the get trip by name, invalid, and create trip. And we're going to go over this code in 1 second. In queries, what we needed is to define a query by using the query function here. In forms, we define by using the forms. And when we define a form, we need to define a schema phrase. And just like I did in here, let's go here, I define the same one for the remote function here. A destination, a start date, both are required, and an end date. Now you can see again that I have a validation to see if the trip is duplicated, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then I'm creating the trip, and instead of returning the trip, I'm going to keep consistent with this code here, and I'm going to redirect. I don't believe I need to throw redirect, I can just redirect, and I need to import that. And this is going to come from trip.id. That's it. That's the same function right now. And I'm going to explain why I did that and why we need this eventually. But before I do so, I want to bring your attention to this part of the code here. By defining this schema here, automatically my form knows that I have a destination of type string, a start date, and an end date. And we only reach the callback function here if the data submitted to this create trip form passes the validation of this schema. If it doesn't, it never reaches this point here. So we are safe to know that, okay, we do have a destination. We do have a start date. It's all good. This is already a change from the previous one. So let me open this side by side here quickly. You can see that in here, I need to manually retrieve the data from the form data and then manually parse this data and manually define what kind of object I want to return with errors, and also need to send back the values that I retrieved here. All this is manual that we need to do, okay? In here, we don't need to do anything for that. We are guaranteed to have the values in here, and also they are valid, and they have already a standard to send errors back. The original values are also sent back automatically. We don't need to do any of that manually. The only validation that I need to do manually here is to make sure that I keep consistent by verifying that there is not another trip with the same destination. And that's what I'm doing here. But another cool part is that I have this issue object here where I can call the method destination being this destination here, saying, okay, the destination field has an error and the error has this description. So this is already tied to the destination field by calling the invalid function that comes from SvelteKit. Okay, now let's go back and update the page to use this. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the method.post here, and I'm going to spread on the create trip form that I'm going to import from trips.remote. If I do that, that's enough to hook up this form to submit to that function that we just created. We need a couple more things to do, and I'm going to do this by changing the input fields, and I'm going to spread on create trip form dot fields that we have, and we now have a destination here. And I'm going to say that this destination here is of type text. I have my classes here, which I'm leaving, okay? And I'm going to circle back to this in 1 second. I'm going to update this other two here, and I'm going to say that this is a start date, and I'm going to leave it as text for a second. And the other one is this, which I'm going to update to be the end date. Now, I'm still looking at errors from the form, and I shouldn't. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this to be an each block, and I'm going to iterate over the create trip form dot fields dot, this is for destination, so destination dot issues as an issue, and for each issue we have a message. And I'm going to do the same thing for the start date that I also have a validation for. So let's do this here and say that this is start date. All right. One more thing I want to do is come back here and say, okay, I don't need this form anymore. And I also don't need this date anymore. And you're going to see why in a second. So I don't need this effect anymore either. When I am capturing the data here, what I'm capturing is the create trip form dot fields dot destination dot value, and I'm gonna do the same thing for the other two, but this is start date and this is end date. Oops, wrong syntax here. This is end date. There you go. And when I'm setting the values back, all I need to do is, because we know that the values here are destination, start date, and end date, I can come here and say that this create trip form that fields can be set to exactly the value here that I'm spreading. because the fields match: destination, destination, start date, and date, and date. That's it. I don't need to keep a local state anymore. The local state now is managed by the form itself. So let's take a look at this in action here. I'm going to reload this, and immediately I see text fields in here, and I wanted to have date fields. Now I can come back here, and instead of having an end date to be as text, is going to be a date. And the same thing is going to happen for the start date. And there you go. We now have date fields. So what's happening in here? First off, we define the create trip form, and it has a schema. This schema here defines which fields exist. Okay. Now, because we know, let me close this for now. Because we know that we have those fields, we have a start date, and start date is a string. I can represent this in a few different forms, being a string as it is. I can represent as all or any of this here. Okay. To see this in a better example, and I'm not gonna go all the way to save this in the database, but I can see that this trip has been concluded, and it is of type Boolean. Okay. So let's just say about that we have a concluded field now. I could, in theory, come here and create another field, and this could be based on concluded. And as soon as I do that, you see an error here, and concluded can only be a checkbox because it is a Boolean, right? And if I save this and come back to my page, you can see that I have a checkbox here that is not properly styled. Let me just remove this class, and you can see that it's now a checkbox. All right, that's it. That's already one of the benefits that we have from defining a central schema. We have a unique central place to define our fields and how we're going to display them in the markup. So let me remove this right now. Remove this because we don't need this. And let's see the form in action creating something here. So I'm now going to travel to Paris, and I'm going to not set a date. We have the validation working as we did before. I'm going to set a date here and create a trip. You see it's saved. If I come back to new trip and I try to create a new one for Paris, we're going to see that I can't. And this is the backend only validation because it's validating against the database. And that's pretty much it. That's all there is to create a simple remote form function. We're going to see a little bit more, but before we do, I just want to mention one thing. Just like remote query functions, this in the end is called as just a normal function. We don't have anything special for it. It's just imported as a function and called or spread in this case as a function, but it is a function. Which means that sometimes we might not want to redirect this if we call this function from other places. We might just want to do something else and not redirect to another route. So that's why we do this kind of thing here. Now, if I do this, what's going to happen is we're not going to be redirect nowhere. I'm not displaying any messages, but I could. And the way to do that is by enhancing the form. Now, I'm not going to display any messages on page. I'm going to redirect, but you're going to get the point. I'm going to copy and paste some more code in here, and I'm going to do this on the form. And just like regular forms, remote form functions can be enhanced as well. I'm going to import this goTo function and go over this. When we are enhancing a form, we get a callback, or we pass a callback, I should say. And from that callback, we get the form, which is an instance of this form here. We get a submit function, which is how we submit the form, and we get the data. And as you can see, it's all typed in here, and it's also based on the schema, but it's only the data from the form. It's not from submitting or getting the result of the form. Now, what I'm doing here is submitting the form to save the trip, then resetting the form because a enhanced form by default does not reset itself alone. We have to do it manually. And then I'm checking if the call for the create trip form.result has a success, and success comes from this that I defined there. And if it is successful, I'm going to navigate using goTo to trips, and again using create trip form.result.trip.id that comes from here. Okay. And if there was an error, I should handle the error here. But let's go and try this again. So let's go to new trip. Let's reload a new trip and create a new one. And I'm going to say that I'm going to go to Toronto. And Toronto, Canada, and I'm gonna select a date and create trip, and I'm redirecting. And now I'm doing that from the client side. Okay, that's it. That's the basic from a simple form. Let's go and now work on entries here. And I'm gonna do the same. I'm gonna start by creating a new remote form function. And so I'm gonna do that by pasting some more code. I need to import the create entry function, and it is just like the other one for creating trips. We define a schema. We have a couple of fields, trip ID and title, that are required. We have a description, and then that's also required. And then we just create the entry and we return the successfully created entry. That's pretty much it. In the trip entries component, what I need to do is just like before, I need to use that form in here, in my form. So I'm gonna leave the class and I'm gonna spread on the create entry form. That's it. Okay. Just like before, also I need to now use the fields that I define in the schema for create entry form, and I'm gonna do that in here. For instance, I'm not gonna use all of this. I'm gonna just create entry form dot fields dot type as a text. And you're gonna see that I have this label here that is referencing the title by the name. I could leave it as is because title matches title, but I can make it type safe. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna copy this part here and I'm gonna update this to use the name. And now this is also type safe because I'm using the same name that has been defined when I define the schema there. Let's do the same for description. This is description. And in here, I'm also gonna update the label. There you go. The missing part now is to display errors, and I'm gonna copy that from this page here. So I'm gonna come here and copy this, come back to the component, and just right under the title input, I'm gonna use the create entry form field, and it's not a destination, it's the title in here. All right, and I'm gonna copy this again and come back under the text area. And now this is description. And I used to have a generic error here. I don't anymore. I'm gonna remove this. Okay, one more thing I need to do is in the button here, the save or the submit button is using this is saving entry. And what we can do is look at the create entry form and see if it is pending. And if it is pending, that means it's pending. What else would you expect? Okay, so I'm gonna copy that and paste here and save. Okay, that's it. Let's test this out and see what's going on. I'm gonna reload just for good measure. And I'm gonna create an entry one in here. And this is task one, and I'm gonna save. And something is not working, and I know what it is. If I look at the trip remote file, when we define this form, we define that we need the trip ID, but I'm not sending the trip ID yet. I'm just sending the description and the title. The trip ID, I'm gonna come here and define an input that is going to be of type hidden, and it's going to be of value trip ID. And all right, I need a name, then it is trip ID. Okay, that's it. I'm sending this now. Let's see if this is working. I'm gonna try and create that entry one once again, save. And now we see the pending state. This form, this model was not closed, and I'm gonna talk about that in 1 second, but the entry was added here, so it worked. Now, why was the model not closed? Because we never told it to do that, and the remote form function doesn't know anything about it. So let's enhance this form once again to make sure that we close the model. And again, that was a decision of mine to use a model to create an entry. So I need to live with the consequence of that decision. Going back to the code here, instead of just spreading here, I'm gonna enhance this form now. And I'm going to comment out this part just because I wanted to show this is working somewhat. Not 100% working yet, but we're gonna see it working in a second. Now I'm enhancing the form. From here, get submit, and I am going to just say that I'm going to close the add entry dialog here. And if I come back and I try to create another entry, so entry number 2, desk number 2, and I'm gonna save, and well, it closed. Okay, we have an entry number 2 and it was automatically closed. But there are more issues that we can see in here. One issue, and I'm gonna show this again, is that we are reloading the photos after we have created a new entry. And in the previous video, when I talked about form actions, I worked really hard to not have the photos reloaded every single time that I created a new entry. But now this is happening again. So how can we fix this? Let me show you that the problem is still persistent so that we can notice this. I'm going to create an entry 3. That's going to be desk 3. I'm going to save it. And now you see the photos are being loaded. One way to handle this is on the remote form function directly. We can come here and say that the get trip entries function is going to be refreshed. And I need to pass arguments in here. Okay, it's the trip ID and the page. So I'm going to pass in the trip ID that we have and the page, which I don't have. So I'm going to just return 1 in this case here. Okay. And what we're going to see is that when I create a new entry, the photos now are not going to be reloaded or refetched. So let me save entry 4 and nothing changed in here. By default, when we call a remote form function, it does invalidate every single query that was triggered on the page, regardless if it is a remote query or a query that came from the load function. So everything gets invalidated. If we do this here, we are now telling SvelteKit which one that we want to invalidate. So it's not going to invalidate every single one, only the ones that we told it to invalidate. Now there's a problem here, right? I don't have this page number. I could add another field here for the page, but once again, I'm going to go back to the same logic that I used for this one and when I change from redirect to returning a data. I'm not sure that every single time someone calls this function, they're going to want to refresh 1 or more queries. I'm not sure about that. So I don't want to do this in here. We could, if you're sure if that's the only place that you're using that, that's perfectly fine. What I'm going to do is invalidate that on the calling side. So that's what this updates is doing. So submit has another function here, updates, and in updates, I can tell that it takes an array of remote queries and you can pass all the queries that you want to invalidate. So I want to invalidate get trip entries, and by chance I have the trip ID in here and I also have the current page. So I'm invalidating the query in the correct state that I want. We can test this again and see that this is now working. So entry 5, desk 5, I'm gonna save the entry, and it didn't update the photos, but updated the entries. And that's pretty much it to do that. Now let's continue because there's more to it that we can do to make this a better user experience. If I come here and I try to create entry 6, I'm gonna bring your attention to one more thing. It takes a long time to save this, close this model dialog, and refresh everything, right? Why? Because I manually decided to make this save entry slow so that we can see all this process, because in real cases, sometimes things are slow, right? I can fix that by adding more logic to the enhance function. I'm gonna paste some more code to replace the existing one, and I'm gonna explain what's going on here. First, I get the data, right? And because I get the data, I can create a new entry with the title, with the data, that description that we have here, the trip ID that we already have. We only needed to add 2 more fields, the ID and the timestamp. Now, when we are updating the queries, we are updating the get entries as we were before, but we can call this with override that takes the current state, which I called result here, but it takes the current state of the get trip entries, and then I can pass an override to it to update what's in memory right now. It will update what it is in memory, and as soon as it gets the data back from the remote call, it's going to update the memory from the results from calling the query once again. But this allows me to take the result, and result here is a combination of having entries and an array of entries and the pagination data, okay? And I'm gonna take this new entry that I just created here and put first in the array of entries. And with that, I can then come here and before calling submit, I can come and close the add entry dialog. So let's see it in action now. I think I'm at entry number 7. And let's save this. There you go. It immediately closes. It displays the entry in here. It doesn't update the photos. So it is working. But there is another issue here. If I come here and try to create a new entry and save without filling any fields and click back again, I see the validation here. So it's closing before validating. Why? Because remote functions or remote form functions are validated when we call submit by default. So we need to validate this before we close the dialog. And we can do that by calling the create entry form dot validate. And this is the async function, so I need to wait. I'll wait for it. And if the create entry form dot fields dot all issues does not exist, okay? Why does not exist? Because this returns either an array of issues or undefined. So if it is undefined, I know that there are no issues and I can close the dialog. So once again, let's see this in action. I'm gonna reload this just to refresh the state, and I'm gonna come here and try to save an entry without any data, and we see the validation is working. I can now come to entry number 8 and desk number 8 and save the entry, and it works. We have a great user experience. Everything is being updated immediately as they should. All right, that's great for creating entries. Let's talk about deleting entries. For that, I'm gonna add yet another remote function. I need to import the delete entry function here. And all this remote function needs is the entry ID, and then it's going to delete it. That's it. I'm gonna come back to the other form that we have here. Now, one thing to consider with this form here is that we have an instance of the form for every single entry in the entries array. And for remote functions, we need a way to identify which one we're talking about. And we do that by adding a const here. And this const, let me import the delete entry form function here. In here, we call the form method for the delete entry form with an identifier here, in this case, entry.id. Now we have a unique delete form function for this specific ID here. And I can come to this form tag and leave the class alone. I'm going to remove this. I'm going to spread this one here, and this is delete entry. If I come back to the page and I try to delete number 8, it deletes, but now we are back at having this problem of loading, which means we need to enhance that form. And we're gonna do that by pasting in some more code in here. Okay, all this is doing is very similar to when we are adding entries. We're calling update when we call submit, but now instead of adding a new entry to the with override, what we're doing is we're filtering out anyone that is equal to the entry that we just tried to delete, right? So that's what's happening here. So let me try this again, and I click on delete and immediately shows that deleted and photos are not reloaded. I can reload the page just to show that we don't have entry 7 anymore. Now, one characteristic of forms is that they cannot be nested. So in the case of entries here, if we needed to delete an entry and the forms are nested, we cannot do that. That's not valid in HTML. What we can do then, instead of creating a form remote function, is create a command remote function. And I'm going to do that by renaming this to command instead of form. So just renaming here, and instead of calling form, I'm going to call command from app server. Everything else is exactly the same. Nothing has changed. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come back here, and the command is not tied to the form element. It can be called from any other element because it's, again, just a function, but it's not tied to the form. So what we're going to do here is we're going to remove this form because we're simulating now that a form, this would be a nested form and we cannot have that. I'm going to remove this because we don't need this anymore. And in this button, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a on-click handler that, and I'm going to call the delete entry command, and I'm going to pass the entry ID with entry.id, and this needs to be made async. I'm going to click on delete here. I clicked, nothing changed in here. So the entry number 6 has not disappeared, but photos has not refreshed either. If I reload this page, we're gonna see that the entry number 6 is not there. Why this happened? Because a command does not refresh queries by default. Form functions do. Command functions do not. So we need to inform which one we need to refresh. In this case, we just want to immediately refresh entries. So let's do that. So a command, much like forms, has a update method. Okay. So instead of typing everything, I'm going to just paste the one that I had for the delete form before. And you can see that it's exactly the same. I'm updating the get entries and I'm automatically removing the current entry that I'm trying to delete. And that's pretty much it. Now, if I come back to the page and I try to delete entry number 5 here, I'm going to click it and it's going to disappear immediately. And if I reload the page, just for good measure, it's not there. So it works. All right, that's all that I had to say about remote functions. In the previous video, I talked about remote query functions. And I think they are pretty neat because they allow us to just query the data that we want in the components that we want in a more precise and granular way. Now, forms, on the other hand, they take a step above. They make the whole process of changing data way more smooth, in my opinion. So much so that I don't even mind the risk right now of using an experimental feature. I've been using that. I believe that the whole experience from sending the data or defining your input forms before even sending the data and having that in the backend validated, ready to be used and saved in the backend feels like a cohesive end-to-end framework experience. It is a way more pleasant developer experience, and it is a way more type safe experience as well. And to me, at least, that matters a lot. So I hope that with this refactoring session, you had a chance to compare the two of them and see which one fits better for you. Keep in mind still that this is still experiment and subject to change. So it's still at your own risk, right? But I have pretty much enjoyed this a ton, and I really recommend you try it out. Thank you very much for staying with me on this one, and see you next one. Thanks.